Hi, my name is Frederick Woodruff, and I am the author of the Substack, the Dahmer Diaries, which is following my process in writing my novel about Dahmer. And today I'm interviewing Robyn Maharaj, and Robyn is the co-author of the book Grilling Dahmer, the interrogation of the Milwaukee cannibal. And we'll be talking today about key elements of the book, her process in writing it, her insights about Patrick Kennedy, who was the key detective that grilled or interviewed Dahmer for many, many weeks. I'm going to have Robyn start by telling a little bit about the way that she met Patrick. I believe it was at a film festival, and then the very odd sequence of events that happened post their meeting, and then the decision to do the book that Robyn spearheaded. So, Robyn, welcome, and thank you for being here. And yeah, please share some of that with us.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Frederick.
Love it. Yes.
Yeah. So, I didn't actually meet Patrick at a film festival. There was a film festival. Well, I mean, I did meet him at a film festival. That was when he and I met for at the very beginning. But initially, he had been at a South by Southwest festival. Him and Christopher Thompson, who is a filmmaker. And he had done a documentary featuring Patrick and two other people talking about the Jeffrey Dahmer story. So it was actually through Christopher that I got in contact through Patrick, because I had decided that I wanted to do an interview with somebody who was connected with the case, because I wanted to do an article about Jeffrey Dahmer. And I'd kind of picked him. Well, first of all, I guess I got interested in writing true crime, and I decided I wanted to just sort of take a stab at writing an article. I'd written as a freelance writer about a whole bunch of different subjects and topics. But as I was getting a little bit older, I thought, I really want to narrow down the things that I am writing about and the things that really interest me, and true crime is one of them. So I selected Dahmer, mostly because to me he was sort of a different and a unique kind of serial killer. Lots had been
Right.
written about Ted Bundy, lots have been written about all these different other guys, and lots could be told about them in terms of documentaries and sort of true crime shows. And a lot of them had a lot of anger, a lot of hatred, a lot of things that was what was driving them to kill. I mean, obviously it's a power thing, and usually very narcissistic people who are serial killers. But yeah, like if you look at Ted Bundy, I mean, he hated women, so the women were his victims, and he was very sadistic with them. He tortured them, and then sort of talked about how much he loved women when really he hated them. And with
Right.
Dahmer, you could say that about a lot of other different killers in terms of what motivated them. With Dahmer, I really felt that what was driving him was the desire to find a partner, to find somebody, because he was really a very lonely man and he really wanted to be in a relationship with somebody. So that was what was driving him. It wasn't the killing, it was sort of the after the fact. I mean, he wanted the body, essentially, is what he wanted. So that's why I initially reached out to Chris, and then Chris said, you really should talk to Patrick, because he's the guy. He actually interrogated Dahmer. He met him. He got to know him really well, and he seems pretty open about talking about it. So he connected us through email, and then for first few months of 2013, he and I corresponded back and forth a little bit, and he agreed to be interviewed for my article. And I think he was happy to do it, because I wasn't wanting to focus on the more grisly and gory sort of aspects of it. I was really
Right.
interested in finding out more about why Dahmer did what he did, more the psychology of it, and those aspects. So we said, okay, yep, this was going to happen. And so he did invite me to come to a film festival that was in Madison. This film of Chris's was being shown there, and he said, I'm going to be there, so we can actually do this face to face. And as you know, as somebody who does interviews, you can so often do these by phone or by email. But there was something that was really driving me to actually like go down there and actually do this interview face to face. I don't know what it was. It was just going to be a guy I interviewed essentially, but there was something that really kind of made me want to go down there and get the full story from him in person. So I did go down there this one weekend in April of 2013, and we did our interview. We had a nice dinner and we talked and talked and talked a lot about Dahmer. And he actually said, I have a lot of notes and different things that might actually help you with your article if you want to go through it. And he even had talked about the idea of, every so often he would take these notes that he had written and kind of, work on them a little bit, reread them. Sometimes he'd get called in to do interviews, so he'd have to kind of refresh his memory about certain things. And but he kind of thought, maybe someday this could be a book. And so I said, well, I just happen to have a background in helping writers to get their stories published. Maybe we could work on that together. So initially it was going to be an article, and then we talked a little bit about maybe working on a manuscript together, like his story as essentially as that detective that was one of the lead detectives in the Dahmer case. And so we did this, exchange. We had this nice visit and this nice meeting together. I headed back to Canada, to Manitoba, where I live, and he went back from Madison to Milwaukee. And then exactly 5 days later, so that was on about the 13th of April, on the 18th of April of that year, 2013, I find out that he had a heart attack. He had a fatal heart attack and died. Patrick, I mean. So I
Right.
was just shocked because I was in the process of reading through all these notes and hearing all this stuff in Pat's voice. Then I find out this man I just met, is gone. So I waited a little bit, and then I finally did this article, which is the one exercising Dahmer's ghost, which was published in 2014. And after I submitted it, or I got it published, I sent it to his widow, Patty Kennedy, and she came back to me and said, you did a really good job kind of assessing and analyzing the relationship between Kennedy and Dahmer. Why don't you just take these notes and see what else you can do with them? Because she said, other than that, they're just going to go back in a desk drawer. She said, I have really no idea how I would go about doing anything with it. So she kind of allowed me to take the manuscript, the notes, and turn it into a book. So that's how the book came to be.
Wow. So I'm curious, and thank you for that detailed and clarification there too, because I didn't realize how that went regarding the film festival and all that with Chris. So something I've always wondered and kept wondering while I was reading your book was, so Dahmer, that whole event with his arrest happened in 1991, and then of course he's convicted, he's in prison, he dies in prison, I think in 94.
Mm-hmm.
And why do you think Kennedy had never thought of wanting to do a book like right away? Or it just seems like he had all the gold as far as his relationship with Jeff. What was it? Just what do you think that was about? Like, what do you speculate as to him not jumping right on that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess there's a few reasons. I guess partly maybe it was that it was all very soon afterwards. Like he kind of, I think his getting all this these notes down and getting all of this information that he had carried while he was doing the interrogation, and then through the trial, and then through Jeff's initial incarceration, and then his being killed in prison. All of this was kind of there, and I think he just kind of had to, as the story continued to unfold right up until Dahmer's death, he wanted to kind of write it all down. And I think for him, it was just sort of almost a therapy. And initially, I don't even think he necessarily thought that this was going to go anywhere. He did eventually, after he continued on with the police force as a detective for 10 more years, and he retired in 2001. And he decided actually to go back to school, and he became a criminologist and was teaching other people going into law enforcement. And he often would use these notes in terms of, as part of what he would be talking about and sort of using real world experience. And of course, those in Wisconsin knew him as the quote unquote Dahmer detective. So, I mean, the story never left him. I guess the telling of the story over and over was always there. And certainly for those 10 years and beyond that he was still with the Milwaukee Police Department, anytime any kind of media or documentary filmmaker or anyone would come to them, they would say, "Oh, well, you want to talk to Pat," and so he was kind of the media person because people wanted to talk to somebody who had actually met and gotten to know Dahmer directly. That exact access was what they wanted. But yeah, I mean, I think he had sort of thought about it. I guess it was sort of a lot of reasons. Maybe he wasn't sure, even how would you go about writing a book? Would he
Hmm.
get somebody to help him? He did say he'd had a couple of other people who had approached him sort of over time, and for whatever reason, it didn't work out, or he initially thought this was going to work, but then they would really want to focus on the gory aspects of it, and he wasn't interested really in that at all. And I think after the Southwest Festival that happened, there was more people talking about it because of the amount of time that had gone by. There was also a few films, like Chris's film had come out. There was the talk of the graphic novel being turned into a film. So there was sort of suddenly this renewed interest in it. But I think once he passed away, the idea was, well, Kennedy's not here to do the story anymore, so there's no point doing the book. Whereas I looked at it as like, this is a story that should be told. Just because Kennedy had a fatal heart attack doesn't mean it shouldn't be told. And
Hmm.
in fact, it becomes a legacy of his life because, I mean, there was life for Kennedy before and after the Dahmer case. But of course, it was a very pivotal time in his life. And I'm also very interested in, like, those things that happen that kind of change the trajectory of your life. Like, if you think about it, Kennedy gets to work this one night in July of 1991. He's just there meeting up with his partner. They're getting their coffee, they're chatting. They get this call in from their captain who says, we just got a call. Seems to be a homicide. You guys are next up. So from that point on, he's going to now be associated with this case. They're told there's something to do with a head in the refrigerator, but they don't know if it's true or not. They're thinking it's a hoax, just a
Right.
big joke, but they have to check it out. So they go down there. He's in the apartment, he's in Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. He sees Dahmer on the ground. The two cops are there. They've wrestled him down to the ground because he did try and get away. Once they realized they had somebody that they needed to really get more information from, they're seeing photographs, they're seeing different things that really are questioning, who is this guy? And he tried to fight them. So when he walks through the door, Kennedy walks through the door, Dahmer's first thing to him is like, "Are you going to hurt me too?" And he's like, "No, I'm not here to hurt you." But yeah, so there's sort of that moment on where he meets Dahmer for the first time. And from that moment on, like, that's it. Like, right up until the week Kennedy died, so many years later, almost 30, 25 years later, he's still talking about Jeffrey Dahmer. So,
Right.
I'm interested in those kinds of stories. So to me, it was like a no brainer. Like, this story has to be told now.
Right. Well, and especially when you look at the amount of material written on Dahmer, meaning the books, it was like, I mean, anybody that talked to him for 4 seconds, like, wrote a book after,
Hmm.
like everything busted wide open. So that's why I was curious about the length of time that went down there with Patrick before the book finally, materialized. I want to back up a little, and this kind of addresses something you were just talking about, which was that immediate connection between Jeffrey and Patrick when Patrick arrived that evening into Jeff's apartment, and they forged the kind of bond that they did. And I want to read from your introduction to the book, which is actually your acknowledgement to Patrick Kennedy, because I've thought this really beautifully summed up the essence of their relationship and why the type of info was procured from Jeff by Patrick. So I'm going to just read a couple paragraphs here that you wrote in that acknowledgement. You say Patrick Kennedy was someone who Jeffrey Dahmer seemed to look up to and wanted to please immensely. Kennedy, who, as a devout Catholic, this really interested me, was naturally drawn to the spiritual and literal confessional model. I also was raised Catholic, so I know exactly what you're talking about there. Um, he had a gentle, unassuming, and non-judgmental method that built a significant rapport that helped Jeffrey Dahmer feel comfortable with finally confiding to someone in authority. Pat demonstrated a willingness to share private truths about himself in a way that worked with this particular and unique suspect. What drew me to tell Pat's story was his compassionate ability to see the humanity in a man who everyone in the world called evil. From the beginning, he chose to hear that man's story and not to judge him as so many people lined up to do. That man, who experts and family said would normally shut down when faced with authorities and confrontation, opened up to this particular detective, a cop he believed from the beginning he could trust to listen to him and help him take on the weight of the story about his murderous crimes. So capsulizes a lot of things that are, to me, such a quandary about Dahmer and seemingly contradictory, views. His, shyness put up against the viciousness and gruesomeness of the crimes he committed. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so it it seems it seems that Kennedy really had some essential quality about himself that allowed him to forge this kind of connection with Dahmer. And is it the same? Do you see it the same way I am? Is that he really was seen beyond, as you say, the whole evil categorization and the monster and all of this, which of
Mm-hmm.
course on one level is fitting, but then he was also a human being. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm curious if you fall. It's kind of a jumbled question, but do you see where I'm heading with that?
Oh, absolutely, and I agree very much on your take of it, and in terms of like the words that you used and what I've looked at in terms of your writing, like to me when I think of the word monster evil, like it's those are just too easy, and it's just too
Right,
easy to label these guys this way. I mean, yeah, it fits sometimes, but it's a little bit too convenient. And to me, the more interesting side of it, and I think this is what drew Kennedy in terms of wanting to kind of gain that trust as quickly as he could. I mean, it seems almost impossible that it could happen so quickly, but I think that because Dahmer's previous experiences with usually authority and the police had always been very positive. Like he was a very, as you say, quiet, shy, very introverted, deferential when it came to authority. So very, very yes, sir, no, sir. So that's how he kind of got away with stuff, is because he was so polite and didn't want to cause trouble. But in this case, he was sort of in it so far beyond that there was no doubt that he was going to get caught that night. First of all, the victim that he had been planning to kill got away from him. He had this handcuff on his arm and he had bolted from the apartment. Dahmer was so out of it because he'd been drinking all night. Now, that wasn't all that unusual because, as most people know, Dahmer had a drinking problem and was an alcoholic and drank all the time. But with
right,
this particular victim, Tracy Edwards, on that night, he had been given a drink by Dahmer that had been laced with the drugs to knock him out, but it didn't taste good. So he kind of pretended to drink it and really didn't drink it. So he was actually more or less in control, whereas Dahmer, over the course of their time together, was getting more and more inebriated. And of course, Tracy Edwards was realizing as time was ticking that I'm in trouble here, that this guy is going to do something and I better get out of here. So all of these things that kind of led to him escaping and to him coming back with the police. I mean, it was all just sort of one thing after another, right? I mean, he just wanted to get that handcuff off, right? Like he's down the street, he flags down a police car, and he's just saying, "Please get this handcuff off me." If they had the right key and had could able to take it off and hadn't really questioned him too much more, that would have been the end of it. But they actually said, "We can't get that off you. We have to take you to the guy who put it on." And that, of course, was the beginning of the end of Dahmer, because they come to his door. Tracy Edwards is there in tow, and they're saying, "Can we come in?" So they come in through the threshold. The place stinks. because it's been, a constant problem of there being these odors that are coming from this apartment. Neighbors have complained. The landlord, caretaker has tried to deal with it. So they come in and immediately they're a little bit suspicious, but they say, we just need the key and we'll be out of your way. And he's fumbling around. Of course, he doesn't know where the key is. So he's given he's given the time to the police that they can kind of check things out. They see these photographs and they realize, well, first of all, they think they're pictures from the morgue and they're wondering, like, how did this guy get his hands on pictures from the medical examiner's office? Then they realize these are body parts and they're from pictures that are in the room that they're standing in. So right away, he's been roughed up. So, that's kind of the first time that ever happened to Dahmer. So he was kind of really knocked for a loop, I think. So he's up, and the first cop that comes in after the two policemen that roughed him up, who of course are in uniform, is Patrick, and he's in the plain clothes, regular suit, tie, and so he's sort of the first friendly face, I think, that Dahmer see. So he challenges him, like, are you going to beat me up too? And he likes what he hears. Like, no, I'm just going to check things out here for a minute. And then we're going to take you downtown and I just want to talk to you and hear what you have to say. So all of this sounded pretty positive. And Dahmer at that moment decided, I'm going to talk to this guy and this guy only.
Hmm.
But a lot of things unfolded that night. And a lot of these things that you mentioned about sort of, the dualship, right? Like he's usually a very passive guy, but yet he could kind of become the kind of person that could drug, strangle, cut up, dismember, perform
Hmm.
necrophilia acts on, cannibalize, all these things, right? Like it's a real opposite, right? In terms
Hmm.
of the two sides of Jeffrey Dahmer.
Hmm.
But yeah, they connected on a lot of things. They talked about religion and they talked about Patrick being like he actually initially was going to be a Catholic priest. That was sort of his interest, and that was his area of interest in terms of
Yes, I
study. He was
remember
going to
that
go
in the
into
book. Blew my
theology.
mind.
Yeah, yeah, but he ended up becoming going into other work and becoming a social worker, and then eventually a police officer. But yeah, I think he was. I mean, even in the time that I talked to Patrick, that one time we met, I could sort of see how people could trust him. He's sort of this big guy, and you kind of get the feeling like, man, everything's going to be okay because he's got this very protective kind of a shield about him. He's massive. And he's got this very deep voice and a real confidence, that obviously made him a very good police officer. But also genuine and was willing to listen. He wanted to talk to me. We talked about other things other than Dahmer, and he was just a very interested person. He was an excellent listener. And also a very good storyteller. So I think he was able to. What got me, I guess, was that fact that he did share these things with Dahmer, things like his own battles with alcohol. Like
Right.
I can't imagine any other situation where a police officer would be sitting in with a suspect and start telling them things like, I was going to be a priest. I used to have a drinking problem. I know what you're talking about. Like really kind of sharing that kind of personal information
Well,
with a
this
guy.
is
But, I guess he realized, yeah.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off, but it just made me think about one of the things in viewing the videos I've watched of Patrick, because he did, quite a few interviews or made appearances in documentaries, as you know. But I always came away with the feeling, and I think this is why Dahmer also responded to him the way he did, was that he really was in touch with his own shadow side. Whenever I would observe him, I was like, oh, this guy is not lopsided. His heart's open and it's
Hmm.
allowing him to, make room for all of the different, facets of his humanness.
Right. Yeah. You always sort of feel like if you watch film or you watch interviews with the tech, they always are playing the super cop, right? Like they're
Right.
tough. They're, and I mean, that's that part of the persona, right? I mean, that's how we want police to feel is confident, is sure of themselves, are the what they're going to be able to go through that door if they have to. Everyone else is running the other way, but they're the ones that are going to go through that door, possibly into a incredibly dangerous situation. So they have to have a certain amount of qualities that, sort of make them come off as, I can do anything. No, they know they're not invincible, but I mean, it makes them, the courage that they need, the bravery that they need to do the job. And, I think Patrick had all of those things, but there was also a real humanity about him. And I think it
Yes.
did come from working in this church and seeing, there's and working with he was also a social worker for a while as well, and he actually worked with inmates who were wanting to come out of the prison system and actually turn their lives around. Like he would work with them and say, look, if you're just going to go off and find some other criminal gig to do, turn around and leave. But if you're here to really turn yourself around, gain some legal skills, we will help you. And so they would buy these old houses that were being foreclosed on. They teach all these guys different skills: painting, electric work, plumbing, whatever. And then they sell that house, buy another house, and then it would be a continuing skills and training opportunity for these guys. So I think that because of all of these experiences, Patrick was the son of a cop. He came from a pretty big family. He just had a lot of empathy and sympathy and humanity, which I'm sure cops have, but they don't always show that. They don't always want to show that. And
Right.
certainly not with a suspect like Dahmer, I don't think, because they didn't really know what they had. They didn't know he was going to be as docile as he was going to be, or as understanding and willing to talk to them, because they really did need him. They needed him to help identify the victims. This is I mean, DNA was happening, but I mean, it was long process before they were able to sort of utilize it the way you would utilize it now. Back then, they had to rely on photographs. They had to rely on Dahmer's memory. They had to rely on, missing person cases that had come in where, the person's information kind of lined up with what they were finding in the apartment. Sometimes it was identification, but they really needed Dahmer to kind of tell the story and outline it all for them and to be helpful. And I mean, he could have been really belligerent. He could have shut down. I mean, that was probably the most likely scenario had he not connected with Kennedy the way he did.
Yes, and I think also as an adjunct to what you're saying, this is something I've thought quite a bit while having to conjure Dahmer in my mind for the novel I'm writing, which I just want to say quickly for people listening to this that may not know the details about the book I'm doing. It's a novel, it's fictional, and it's sort of what I'd call a parallel history kind of retelling of Dahmer. And it really basically takes place the years before Dahmer goes off on his spree. So he's already committed one murder, the first one of Stephen Hicks in 78, and then
Mm-hmm.
goes to college, Army, Florida, is back and tries to get his life together, and then meets the protagonist of my book. And then it's about their relationship. So it was my way of trying to uh, understand Dahmer through art rather than science. So anyway, I didn't mean to go down that rabbit hole so hard,
No,
but
it's
I just
fascinating, Frederick. It really is. I would love to read this. I'm dying to read this.
and writing this book and getting into Dahmer's head the way I kind of imagine it. And of course, I also have the asset of being an astrologer, which I'm not going to go too much into that, but character is able to actually be read through a horoscope. And of course, I'm using that as one of my tools in comprising this portrait of Dahmer. But anyway,
Mhm.
I think Dahmer, for the first time in his life, once he was with Kennedy and then the other people, that were interviewing him, the 8 or 9 shrinks and all that followed, he finally had like this interest coming from other people. Of course, the reasoning was horrifying, but he had this attention and was able to talk about this thing that was his like primary passion in his life. It would be like someone like coming up to you and saying, "Oh, tell me everything about what it is to be an artist and a writer and a journalist." And, it's things we're passionate about. So we're going to,
Mhm.
just get in there and start talking about it. It's,
Mhm.
it's so absurd. But I think for Jeff, it was the same thing. Like, oh
Mhm.
God,
Attention. Yeah.
well, that, and
Yeah.
he was an expert at what
Right.
he, from the taxidermy days as a teenager through his medical training in the army and blood taking and the blood banks. And worked as a butcher or what, like it was his fate, just had it all lined up in a certain way. Of course, it went haywire in the direction it
Yeah.
took, but people ask me like, well, how could how could this happen? How could somebody do this? And I always say to them, well, imagine the thing that you're most interested in and passionate about in your life, you know and you're just becoming a maven or an expert at this thing. And of course, for Dahmer, it was a horrifying nightmare of what he was
Yes.
becoming an expert, but it was still oh my god, it was
Yeah.
still driven by this
Yes.
kind
Yeah.
of passion. And so he had
That's
this
right.
fake exterior of this docile blonde, kind of nebbish. And then beneath that, this chthonic, level of existing in the underworld, basically, and taking people
Right.
down with them. So
I got
I
right.
mean,
Yeah.
does that make sense?
It,
That,
it does, and in fact, some of the things you mentioned kind of made me think as well. Like another sort of parallel dichotomy with Jeff's life, which you kind of touched on, which I'll just bring back, is that
yeah,
for the first part of his life, it sort of seemed like he had no control, right? He had no control at all. He had no control of his parents and the fighting, and sort of the them fighting and being so focused on their relationship and how bad it was that they kind of, I don't want to say neglected the kids necessarily, but they were kind of, just on the side of this. They didn't want to be fighting in front of the kids. But of course, Jeff heard it all and saw it all and witnessed it all. So, there was really little control that he had in his home life. As he was going on in life, he kind of got very dependent on alcohol. And then that kind of took away, I think, any motivation or drive that he might have had. He was sort of a young guy, and his dad and stepmother started to have to point out, okay, well, why don't you go try going to college? Like, what are you going to do after high school? Well, let's get you signed up at college. Well, he just sort of drifted along and went into that. That didn't pan out because he kind of drank his way out after 3 months. Okay, well, we'll set you up in the army. So he was kind of like a pinball, like everyone was kind of directing his life, and he had no control, no say really. He just went along with whatever was being, sort of directed of him. But when he was killing, he was completely in control. When he picked his victim and his victim agreed to come back to his lair, he even said as soon as he locked that door with his victim inside, he knew that that was it. Like, he knew that he had them and they were his. And so there was sort of, when he was killing and going through the deception of who he was in that side of his life, that was the power side of him. Whereas the rest of the time, he was doing very menial jobs. Here, Jeff, go do this, go do that, go stir this, go, I mean,
hmm
it was just sort of like just barely subsisting. He had enough money to buy alcohol and pay his rent, which in the end, he didn't even have enough money for that. But
right.
there was sort of these times in his life where, and again, once he was caught and captured and he was sort of the center of attention, he actually had control then again, because they were all waiting to hear what he had to say. I think for him, in terms of talking to all these people, don't forget, once he was in prison, he had to sober up, right? He suddenly didn't have access to alcohol anymore. And so I think a lot of his feelings kind of returned, and a lot of his emotions that had
Yes.
been dead for so many years because of his alcohol abuse finally were sort of starting to come alive again. And people were asking him things, talking to him, as you said, sort of taking an interest in him. And I think he actually became a more interesting person once he sobered up.
Right. But and I would back up with what you're saying and add to that. I mean, yes, the alcoholism was a huge factor, as just floating around in, some other vector than we all do in everyday life. But I've often thought about this, thinking back to when I was in high school and then I graduated, my life, a big question mark in front of me. I mean, I was one of those kids. I had no desire to go to college and all of that, was done with school. But I keep thinking, like, Jesus Christ, like, if I had murdered someone like 2 weeks out of high school,
Mm-hmm.
I just can't imagine how my life would ever have really, unless I confessed and did you know, here's the Catholic in me, penance, and was punished by society and sort of cleared the stain. Having not done
Hmm.
that, and then carrying this forward, I can just see why the alcoholism just ratcheted up to
Yes. Yeah.
this thing in your mind, I've taken a
Yeah.
human life. And I think that really, my impression of Dahmer is that that really opened up kind of a door to the underworld, for a lack of a better way of putting it. And
Yeah, an escape, a total escape from the reality of what he had done, where his life wasn't going, and absolutely the guilt of it, and the questioning, like, should I confess? Should I tell somebody? And just not feeling like he had the courage to do it.
well, and also the having rubbed up against the power of taking another person's life, because that's
Hmm.
very, as disturbing as it sounds. I think it can be a seductive thing. Like, wow,
Hmm.
I could do this. I snuffed out another life. And I think that stayed there kind of in a nascent way with Jeff. And then, he fought it those 9 years, living with his
Hmm.
grandmother and then getting at the Oxford, and then just the thing with Stephen Tuomi, just I mean that bit, for people that don't know, Jeff went 9 years after his first murder, and then in a drunken blackout with a young guy he took to the Ambassador Hotel, he woke up out of that blackout and saw that he had, murdered another person, and had absolutely no
Hmm.
recall of it. Do you
Hmm.
believe that about Dahmer, that he was total, he has, I mean, till his death he said he never recalled committing that murder?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I do, in that, I mean, I know that these kind of alcoholic blackouts can happen, and that he had experienced them in the past. And I mean, to be honest, he really didn't have to even confess that murder. Like, I mean, no one knew it
True.
about it, right?
Right.
So that
Good
one,
point.
actually, when they were starting to talk about it, there was no evidence of that killing that he had in the apartment, because at that time he was still living at his grandmother's house, and whatever trophies I guess he had. I mean, he really didn't even have to come forward with that one. And but yeah, I do believe it. I mean, he said, I must have killed him. I had to have killed him because I was the only one there, and he did have the bruises on his arms. And it showed the bruises on the body of the young man, and he could feel the pain. And so he said, I must have done it, but he didn't seem to not remember doing it. So I don't know. I seem to trust that, I guess, because there were times that Kennedy and his partner, like, they were trying to trick him, and just to see if they could catch him in a lie, because they were sort of like, do we believe everything he says? Do we think he might be holding back on us? So occasionally they would sort of put these little things in there just to test his recall. And he would say, oh, no, no, it wasn't this, it was this. Don't you remember? Oh, yeah, okay. And so they would sort of test how he was telling these things, sort of chronologically. So I
Yeah,
do believe that.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think you wrote about they would actually bring in, like, photos that had nothing to do with any of the murdered people, and try, put them before Jeff, and he always would
Hmm.
reject them, like, no, no, so they were always kind of fine tuning on his truth telling. I'm going to just kind of go free fall here with you and ask some questions. And then also, I think I mentioned this to you, the Reddit group that I'm in. I had spoken with the hardcore uh, subredditors there, and they gave me a list of questions. Some of those I'm going to ask you as well. But one of the big
Hmm.
ones I've always wondered about regarding your book and Patrick's book is, why weren't the interviews taped when Jeff was brought in? Because that first night he was in, I think, for like 6 7 hours, that first interview with Kennedy. And why didn't they tape the interviews?
That's a good question, and I'm not entirely sure why they did it, because if you've seen the 3-part, or I think it's 3 or 4 part documentary on Netflix, not the
Yes.
10-part episode that's acted, but the actual conversations with the serial killer, featuring Jeffrey Dahmer. It's actually his lawyer, the junior lawyer, Wendy Patrikas, whose
Yes.
recordings are the ones that they are featuring of that. And sometimes you hear another voice in the background. So it did kind of make me wonder, like maybe once they got the lawyer in, then I think those sessions were recorded. But maybe that first night, they just kind of wanted to sort of see what was going to happen. They could have thought, well, maybe a tape recorder would put him off. Because I think he just wanted to kind of go in there and kind of get the basic information, see if he would even be able to get him to say anything.
Hmm.
So that might have been why they didn't do that first night. Yeah.
Have you ever talked with Wendy? I know there's talk of her. Uh, there's a book she's due out with, I think, Defending the Devil. Horrible title. But have you heard much about that, or?
I haven't been in touch with Wendy myself, but a woman I know who's in Florida has been in touch with Wendy, and had told me a few years ago that she had been working on a book. And, and I guess for her too, this is a chance to kind of put down her story, because she would have some really interesting insights to Dahmer. And now with the renewed interest in the story, that the chances of her finding a publisher for it, I think, would be very good. But yes, I haven't spoken to Wendy myself. She is, of course, featured in the book because she is, of course, the lawyer that came in and was part of the interrogation every day that Kennedy was part of.
Right. Yeah, it's so fascinating when you watch the court TV stuff of the trial and you see Wendy and then the other gal, I forget her name, that were the junior attorneys on the case. There's just such a palpable bond there.
I thought Wendy had put it really perfectly in one of the interviews that she did for that show, that Netflix show, because she said, there were times when she felt like a mother to Jeff, even though he was a little bit older than she was. Sometimes she felt like a sibling, like a sibling to him,
Yep.
and other times she felt like a therapist. So
Right.
that's very interesting. But I mean, I think that for the most part, Jeff was a nice guy. Like, he wasn't rude. He wasn't sort of a belligerent guy. Like when you sort of think back on other killers, even if they're not being rude and belligerent, but like when I watched the one on Gacy, and not, I don't want to start changing the topic here, but just the one on Gacy, like I found it so frustrating because he was in such denial about everything, and he was
Mm,
so perfect and whatever, and it's like, you don't get that from Jeff. Like he's very, he just sort of seems to be mindful, and I think once he was off the booze, he actually did feel a lot of remorse for the victims, and how could he have done all that, and how could he have caused so much trouble. And that's to me, it does ring genuine. Maybe there's a little bit of naivety to me thinking that, maybe others are like, no, he was a stone cold killer, but I actually think that out of all of the killers that are out there, he's the one that kind of did show some remorse. And he did say to Kennedy, if there's anything I can do to make up, I can't really make up for what I've done because I can't bring those men back. But if there's anything I can do to help, then I want to do it. And that's when they said to him, you can help us identify these victims, because we need to give names to these people. We need to give names to these victims. So
right.
once he heard that, he was all in. So
Right.
that's why if someone said, oh, well, he lied about this or whatever, I wouldn't put it completely past him, because obviously, clearly, he had to be a good liar. Like if you think about that time when he gets caught back in '78, and he's taking these garbage bags to the dump, and he gets stopped by a cop who's saying, what's in the bags, and at that point, he could have confessed and could have said, but he managed to very skillfully lie. So, he was a very skilled liar.
Yeah,
He
I
lied
think he
to his
was
dad,
quite
he lied to his
cunning.
grandma.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
very slick liar. And that kind of survival instinct would just flare in him and say, just the way he dealt with the one case, that terrible situation where the kid had escaped and was out on the
yes,
street.
yeah,
Right. But this
yeah.
this thing of the charm of Dahmer, coupled with his attractiveness, is a very interesting topic that fascinates me. I think there's a psychological term like hybristophilia, which
Mm-hmm.
is that obsession that people get into with killers or criminals, where they're idealized and the like
Romanticized. Yes.
romanticized.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, especially after this Netflix thing, you see these sites and they're like all these fangirls about how cute he is and how handsome he is, and it's like, what?
Well,
I mean,
that
yeah, he
I
was a good
that
looking guy.
that took
Yeah,
on a level of like a supernova, I think,
yeah.
because of Evan Peters
Yes,
and
yeah. There
him.
was very much a melding of the actor and the character and the
Exactly.
character and the killer. Yes, I agree
Though
totally.
I
Yeah.
think Dahmer's actually was better looking than Peters, which, I thought that was an interesting casting choice if they were going for authenticity as far as physicality. But
Right.
I think I know why Ryan Murphy did what he did with Peters. But yeah, that conflation of this, I think Peters had just come off some big Marvel movie like Silver
Hmm.
Surfer or something, which of course every person on the planet except me saw. And then the Netflix series, and then just this explosion of like Dahmer mania and fandom. I
Hmm.
mean, I don't know
Hmm.
how much you trawl around social media like I've done in researching my book, but it is crazy ass out there with
Hmm. Hmm.
people, obsessing over Dahmer. I mean, gay men, women, they can't seem to develop any clarity about why, and they've given up thinking about it, and then they just post, images and memes and love letters
Hmm.
and illustration and art. What do you make of that? What's your take
It's
on the hibrostophiliacs?
well, I mean, I can't say I really understand it at all. I mean, I guess it kind of, it sort of shocks me a little bit because, I mean, I'm on a few groups now to follow it a little bit. And of course, people send me stuff. And it's like, gee, a Jeffrey Dahmer bobblehead. And like, like
Right,
what the world really needed, right?
right.
And so it's very puzzling to me. It's sort of weird and humorous. And of course, you always think of like the victims, like, there's all this stuff and talk about who he was and kind of this like he's infamous. He's absolutely infamous. I can't think that there's really that many places in the world where you can go and not know who he is. And in fact, one of the stories I will sometimes tell about Patty, this is Kennedy's widow. She and her sister, they had gone to Italy and they were in Venice and they were in one of those gondoliers, traveling up and down. And the gondolier asked them, oh, he could tell from their accents. They were American. And he said, well, where are you from? And they said, Milwaukee. Or she said, Milwaukee. Oh, Jeffrey Dahmer. So like, you can't escape it, right? I mean, it's sort of everywhere. And it's just become even more prevalent since the whole Netflix thing. I guess there's a couple of things. Like, I guess there's, the fact that he was kind of a handsome guy. I think the fact that it's sort of an open and closed case, like he's no longer alive. So there's sort of this period of time where, he was being photographed a lot. There's a lot of images, footage of him, couple of interviews. It was sort of just at that time when 24-hour news cycles were breaking. And so once this story came out, I mean, there was like media from all over that came to cover the case, and that was kind of one of the first cases that was like that. So it kind of has its sort of place in that kind of news media history.
Hmm.
But it touches on a lot of things. It touches on race, it touches on gay lifestyle and
Yes.
sort of how things have changed. How things were then to how things were now, and it sort of taught the whole thing about race and sort of how people talk about him being the way he was in terms of picking up men and these men coming back to him. Not a lot of understanding back then, and you could tell from the way they portrayed the police. Geez, we got to get out of here. And it's sort of startling to see, like, geez, that wasn't that long ago. Like, that was 30 something years ago now. But
Right.
the way that we have changed On the other hand, there was sort of very much the black and white. Why were the officers listening and believing Jeff Dahmer over the two black lady neighbors who were saying, no, no, this kid doesn't live here. He's a child. He's not an adult. He doesn't have a boyfriend. Like, it's a kid. Oh, no, no, it's my boyfriend. I've got pictures and his ID upstairs. And they believed Jeff. Well, why was that? Was it because he was a nice guy and charming? Or was it more because he looked like them? He sounded like them. He was keeping it calm. The two ladies were a little hysterical for whatever reason, but there's sort of lessons learned, I guess, that could come possibly from that. So there
Mm.
is, I guess, a bit of interest in that as well. And I guess there is something that is a little bit sympathetic about Dahmer. And I think it is because people recognize, especially after they see the Netflix show, like, he really was looking for love. He was looking for a partner. He was looking for a boyfriend. Yes, he was a very selfish man. He didn't really want like a relationship with any kind of conflict or problems. He really wanted a very docile, almost like a zombie boyfriend. But really, what he was looking for was someone that would never leave him. And I think that that kind of resonates with people. I think people feel a little bit of a pang of sympathy for him. Not for
Mm.
all of the things he did, obviously, but clearly for that sort of loneliness, which I think a lot of people can kind of relate to.
Yeah, that's a good point. And this is something I explore, I'm trying to in my novel, is like how much of that related to Jeff Dahmer's character was really about a fear of abandonment, or was it really just about having that event happen in the moment where the person's life was removed, and then there was still some warmth there in, sorry, the corpse, that he could then fully engage with without any fear of reciprocation or aggression. It seems like it was something that started sort of simply and accidentally as a fantasy, meaning,
Hmm.
the one with the hitchhiker. And I've always thought, even before the murder of Stephen Hicks, the first murder that Jeff did, just the thought that he had of like, well, I'm gonna get a baseball bat and saw it in half and wait in the bushes, and then I'm gonna
Knock out a
leap,
jogger.
and yeah, I will take this, drag him into the bushes, and he's unconscious, and have my way with it. But I
Yeah,
thought,
yeah.
wow, that was really the first link in a crazy chain. Did I get this from you, where if people are polled like who the three most evil people are in the world, they list like Hitler, Stalin, and Dahmer? Was
Yes,
that
that yeah. I said that a few times. I think I might
wow?
have written it out
I
somewhere too.
just
Yeah.
I did, I wrote that the other day in a Substack post, and I didn't know who to attribute that to. Now I'll have to go in and add that. But yeah, that blew
Well, I
my
think I had,
mind.
yeah. Yeah, I think I had seen it in one of those like BuzzFeed listicles or whatever, just
Right.
someplace really random. But that's actually what kind of triggered me to kind of be interested, because it's like, I know the Dahmer story a little bit. I mean, I know he was, kind of a bad guy. He did some terrible things, but really like the third most evil person in history, like that just seemed like a bit of a leap. And so I sort of thought that's kind of what got me thinking, like, I'd like to explore this guy a little bit more, find out more about what made
God.
him tick. Going to say that just because you mentioned and have mentioned a couple times that 9 year gap, I always also think it's quite fascinating to think about him thinking like he could get caught at any time. So there's that fear, but also as time went on, that feeling of like I'll never get caught. Like it's so long ago that they'll never get caught. So there's sort of that dichotomy there as well, of
Yes.
feeling like the fear and then also the invincibility, which I think he actually carried on, because the more times he got away with things and talked his way out of things, the more chances he took, I think.
Let's do some of the questions I got from the Reddit folks. One of them I thought was a good one. Some of them actually really revealed to me that they had, some of them felt like you had met Jeff or had been through the trial, things like that. So
Mm.
obviously, I'm going to skip those. But one person asked, what I wonder is if there were certain aspects and parts of Robyn's book that were more difficult for her to write than others.
Um, guess just in terms of the latter part of the book, right? It's a little bit more of my own assessment, I guess, about Dahmer, because I don't have a background in criminology or psychology, but it was just sort of like a layman's sort of analysis based on research and conversations and things that I'd had. I guess that was the only part, because I didn't want it to come across as being sympathetic to him, but I also thought, so many people are just so focused on sort of the cannibalism, the necrophilia, and sort of those aspects of Dahmer, and that's all they kind of want to know about him. And it's like that's sort of the one of the things about him, but there's sort of more to him, I think. And I sort of
Mhm.
wanted to explore some of that. As far as Dahmer's story goes, I really just, it was Kennedy's story, really. And so I didn't really feel, I guess there was a little bit of a distance there that I didn't really feel as like, ooh, this is going to be trickier or uncomfortable. It was just, I guess when they learn, as they're learning things, like that he was cannibalizing some of his victims, that necrophilia was a big attraction, that he was very interested in the insides of dead things, and they started to do the inventory. I mean, those things were a little startling, yeah, for sure.
Right. It's interesting, when I read, I'm sure you read it as well, Shrine of Jeffrey Dahmer by the UK writer, Brian
Hmm.
Masters. It's interesting in there, he, in talking about the cannibalism, makes a statement about that maybe it was, I think he's accessing his interview with Dennis Nilsen, that other serial killer in the UK. If you
Hmm.
read his book, Killing for Company, a master's book was titled that. Nilsson had said that he felt Dahmer was kind of fantasizing the cannibalism, didn't really commit it. And then Masters brings up in Shrine that the police chief at the time said, well, there's really no, signs of anything like this having happened. Um, and then I think later there was something like, well, maybe there was human tissue on eating utensils or something like that. So
Yeah,
it seemed
yeah,
like a
yeah.
gray area. What's your take on the cannibalism thing?
Well, I personally, I don't know why anyone would admit to it if they hadn't done it. So, I'm not really sure why that. And I mean, they got Jeff talking about it. They got him talking about how he would prepare it, what he would use, like sauces or
Right,
barbecue,
right.
whatever. And and he would sort of be talking about it in a very matter of fact way. I don't think he was bragging so much. They did say to him, "Well, why didn't you mention this before?" Like they had to bring it to him because they said, what they're saying in terms of victims, like victim numbers that Jeff's confessing to based on what they're finding in the apartment is just not quite jiving. And so that's when they started to examine things like saws, knives, kitchen utensils, plates, the sink in the kitchen, and they were finding remains. So that's when they said, well, this is what we are concluding. So they brought it to Jeff's attention, and he did admit it, like he didn't deny it. And
Hmm.
they said, well, why did you just tell us this, to start? And he said, well, I didn't want you to think worse of me, was his
Right,
response. So,
right. I think I
yeah,
remember that
yeah.
reading that. This was an interesting question. I don't know if you have an answer to this, but someone asked, why did the Milwaukee Police Department have a precedence over the FBI in the interrogation of Dahmer?
Well, I think that they brought them in, like the FBI came in, and I think they actually kind of came in uninvited. It might have had something to do with the fact that because all of the crimes happened in Wisconsin at that point, like they didn't know at that point about Stephen Hicks in Ohio. So they might have said, well, because it all occurred in one state, we want to have the state would have the jurisdiction over a federal body. But I
Hmm.
think my understanding of it is the FBI kind of came in and sort of like the experts that they feel they are in serial killing, and because they have the behavioral science unit and all of that working with them, and at that point it was still kind of a newer science, but still they had had some of that experience in interviewing other serial killers, and so they felt like these guys in Milwaukee, this is going to be a first for them. We should kind of offer up our advice, and we should sort of be there to talk to them. And they also were bringing in crimes like outside of Wisconsin. So one of the crimes that they actually brought in was Adam Walsh, because they knew that Dahmer had spent some time in Miami in the late I guess in 1980, 81, and that's when Adam
Y-
Walsh had
Yeah, that young
been
boy,
abducted.
yeah, that was found
Yes,
is
John Walsh's son,
decapitated. Yeah,
Adam. Yeah. So as soon as there was that, that there was mutilation and that all that had been found was a head, in that case, they said, they were quick to talk to him. But as far as like why they had that jurisdiction, I'm just guessing that it's because that at that time they thought all of the crimes were going to be just isolated in the one state of Wisconsin. So they kind of came in and said, we're here, we'll offer our advice. They wanted to show Jeff some pictures, but essentially the Milwaukee police never did give up the authority on it. So I just stayed with them. And
right.
also, too, that they were pretty sure that Jeff was going to be pleading guilty.
So something that occurred to me when I read your book and Pat's book was sometimes I would be like, and this, I'm reading the list of questions here. This is what triggered me thinking about this because someone asked how much is exaggerated in grilling Dahmer. And I sometimes when I was reading it, I was like, God, I don't know, I can't picture Dahmer saying that or that kind of a convo going down or so I that's why I was always interested like wow why wasn't this taped how much like were you working off of like Kennedy had taken like just massive notes and then it was
Yeah.
compiled like say some more about that process, Robyn.
Sure. Well, I think what he had to do is like every time they were interrogating Dahmer, they kind of filed reports afterwards, and these were sort of official documents that made up the case file. But I think when he got home, just to kind of help deal with it, he would be writing out the conversations that they'd had and what they had uncovered, just kind of for his own personal, so almost like therapy or just kind of getting it off his chest, getting it out of his head and maybe thinking that someday down the road I might need this, like if I'm getting called to testify or whatever, I might need these notes to help recollect. And so I think it was just sort of something that he did as just sort of a way of kind of marking the case as it was going on. And
Hmm.
so a lot of those were conversations, that he had, quote unquote, how accurate they were. I mean, he didn't have a tape necessarily to go back and forth to. I mean, there might have been tapes, but I don't think he necessarily had access to them if they belonged to his lawyer. Dahmer's lawyer, I mean. But I mean, they're, I don't know. I mean, I guess, are they verbatim? I can't really say for sure. I just was going by what he had provided as his notes.
So you had the collection of notes and then it was your uh creative process to put all of that into that chronological order
Yeah,
from
and to
the
kind of chronicle or to kind of shape it into a story. Like he didn't really have anything about I mean, he did talk about the situation with the 14-year-old boy, but he didn't put it. He put it way down in the story. I had it initially, with the voices and the conversations going back and forth with the 911 operator and one of the neighbors. He didn't really write about the June 1978 incident, but I knew that was going to be important because it was going to come up later. So I
mm,
sort of more or less shaped it into more of a narrative. I mean, it was for him, it was very much like point form notes, some conversation, but it was the work that was involved was just a bit of additional writing, the narrative out and then shaping the story to sort of be the way that it would tell best, how to break it up in terms of chapters and things like that.
right,
And then
that makes
because he
sense.
passed away, I also wanted to make it as a bit of a legacy for Patrick in terms of telling his story, in terms of his growing up and telling his life in terms of before and after the Dahmer case.
Right. And how was Patty with the her response, Kennedy's wife, once the book was out?
Well, I think she was really pleased that it came out. I think it's a very conflicted thing for her
Mm,
because she is a long time Milwaukee resident, and so
mm,
she, like a lot of the people there, I'm sure, just wish that the story would just like go away. Like
mm,
just go away because it's been a long time. And I often think about it because where I live, I mean, I'm in a city that's not that much bigger than Milwaukee, and so I kind of imagine like imagine if that had happened here 30 years ago and would we ever forget about it? Would we ever be allowed to forget about it? Is it just going to be a part of our history forever? And so she has kind of a love-hate thing for this. Like
got it.
she wanted me to be able to tell Pat's story for Pat's sake. And she was really, I think, pleased and happy that I took the interest to do it, because, as I said earlier, she said this is going to just go back in his desk drawer for whatever. And so she said if you can do something with it, great. But
Right.
she's never taken anything for it. She's read it, like she read it before it went to print, because there was a few things I just wanted her to kind of clarify and double check. She provided me with some of the background on his Pat's background, like his history, personal history. But yeah, I mean, I think she's very sad about the whole Dahmer thing. I think she's tired of it. And I think for a lot of people, it just dredges up a lot of pain and suffering. And like, not just pain that he inflicted on the victims and those families, but on the city of Milwaukee. So for her, it's very, very bittersweet. Like, she loves
Right.
that it's, Kennedy's story, but it's the fact that it has to be tied to this serial killer is very unfortunate.
Yeah, a friend of mine here on the island I live on, she grew up in Milwaukee, and I was just talking with her the other day, and she was asking me about, the book I'm writing, and so I started asking her stuff about growing up there during the arrest and the trial and then Jeff's murder in prison. And she said, it's you can't really even imagine like what it really did to everybody, and
Mm-hmm.
she was a young child at the
Mm-hmm.
time, and this steady inculcation of, from the media and Dahmer on television, 10, 12 times
Yeah.
a day, more and more details being revealed. She said it really was like a mind fuck. So I
Yeah,
can
it
see
really
that.
makes you wonder, like you think of a guy like Dahmer, like you would pass him on the street and you would never think of anything like this. And,
Hmm.
you never know what's going on behind that door, right?
Hmm.
With just the depravity of some people, it's just, they don't wear it, so that you can see it clearly. It's there, and what they're thinking about, what they're fantasizing about, what they're hoping for or dreaming of. Sometimes it really goes into dark places, and we have no idea.
Do you feel this is sort of like the end of Dahmer mania, or like what do
Yeah.
you, it just seems like the gift that keeps on giving. Like, I mean,
um
or the
yeah, in
terror
a
that
sad
keeps
way.
on.
Yeah.
But I mean, what?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I know what you're saying. It's kind of funny, and I think about it because it seems like almost I don't know, every 5 years or so, there seems to be a renewed interest in his story. And I think that, yes, now that it's been done by the Netflix series, the Evan Peters series, it'll probably take a long time for someone to kind of think, okay, well, that story needs to be told again. Mind you, I think they've signed it up for another 2 to 3 seasons with the same topic of Jeff Dahmer. And I'm trying to think, like, what are they going to do?
No, they're doing. My sense is it'll be Gacy. I think they're taking on individual serial killers for the.
Oh, okay. So they're
Yeah,
done with the
what could they
Dahmer thing then.
possibly
Okay.
have done on
Well, this
Jeff
is the thing. I mean, it was
anymore?
from birth to him being killed in prison, right? I mean, they really covered the 31 years of his life well.
Yeah.
I thought they actually did a very good job of that, and focusing on certain things. But anyway, but as somebody I think once told me, like, true crime readers are born every day. so,
Oh my
so
God,
for
that's
those that like
true.
who, yeah, so that for those, maybe in 5 years there will be another renewed interest in this case. And I think because, like, Dahmer has really kind of crossed over into a whole other thing, and I've heard, I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard, oh well, people are starting to talk about a course at the university on Dahmer, like just
Yes.
on him.
Yes.
So there, the areas of study that you could explore with him, I think, are quite a bit still. I mean, it's hard to believe that there's anything more that could be said or should be said, but there's always artists out there who find new ways, such as yourself, to kind of tell the story.
Well,
So it's kind of
exactly.
fascinating. It's fascinating and it's interesting, and it is a little bit like mind blowing, because it's like, wow, there is a lot of. When I first did the book back, like when I did it in 2016 initially, and it was called Dahmer Detective, and it really only came out in Canada. Um, and so, I mean, it sold pretty well and everything. But once I knew that Netflix was doing something, I kind of thought, oh, well, I should see if an American publisher would be interested in this story. So really, Dahmer came out as a result of Wild Blue Press taking it on. And it just seems like, wow, I mean, there doesn't seem to be an end, and those people who want to read it about it.
Is Blue Press, is that uh their forte? I don't know what.
Yeah, Wild Blue Press. They're in Denver, Colorado, and it's sort of true crimes, mysteries, horror, thrillers. That's
I
one of
see.
their areas of expertise. But yeah, they do a lot of true crime.
I see.
Yeah,
So this
yeah.
must have been a great uptick for them with the Netflix, and then the renewed interest in your book and Pat's book for sure.
Yeah, I think once they knew that that was coming and there was starting to be a little bit of chatter about it, like once they named the actor who was going to be in it and the director started to talk a little bit about it, it sort of seemed to be coming up more and more. And then,
Hmm.
I guess there was just a lot of people. I think, as someone said, it's like the second most streamed television show in history. So tons of people saw it, and sometimes, a lot of times, those shows lead to people being even more interested. And I want to read more about this person now. So.
Right.
Yeah.
So the final question I have for you, and this is coming really from my experience in being immersed in Dahmer for God 6 7 months now with this first draft of my book, is because you're up ahead of me on the road. Like what was your experience like of being immersed so long, like with Dahmer sort of floating, through your psyche or your creative process? Or, I wake
Mhm.
up in the morning and I'm focused on him and the book, and then I'm trying to go to sleep at night and different plot things. But
Yeah.
how was that for you? And then how did you off gas, like when the book was done and stuff?
Well, yeah. I mean, certainly when you're working on a project like this, whether it's a painting or it's a manuscript or whatever script, whatever it happens to be. I mean, in order to really fulfill it and to, sort of give it everything you can, you really do have to immerse yourself in the subject matter. And so it was a lot of reading, a lot of research, a lot of going over the notes that I had from Patrick. Just in sort of, kind of even in my own insights, like one of the things I had done prior to my interview with Pat was I'll just give you an example. Like one of the things that I had always thought was that when uh, Dahmer's mother left, like she left with the younger son, so his
Yes.
little brother David, they left the house in Ohio. And then it was kind of like, oh, well, gee, poor Jeff was abandoned and left on his own for a couple months. And, what kind of parents would do this, et cetera, et cetera. That was sort of the narrative a little bit. But
Yes.
I questioned Kennedy and I said, to me, from what I've learned about Jeff and what I could kind of surmise about how he might, kind of connive and manipulate a little bit, because his mother Joyce was so upset with the dad, Lionel. I think she said to Jeff, we're leaving now. We've got the car packed up and we're heading to Milwaukee. You tell your dad that you're home by yourself and he'll come back, because he was living in a hotel at that point with the girlfriend. And so I think that Jeffrey purposely didn't phone the dad, because he's like, hey, I could be in the house by myself. I just graduated from high school. I'm 18 years old. There's like a bar inside the house, like free drinks. I've got food for a while at least, and I could just
Hmm.
have the whole roam of the house. And that's in fact when he committed the murder, right? So he
Right.
had all this time to just, do whatever he wanted to do, fantasize, masturbate, whatever. He could just do what he wanted to do, drink, and go cruising around and try and find somebody. So that was my sort of presentation to Patrick. I said, do you think it's possible that he kind of neglected to tell his dad? Because when the dad came back 3 months later, he was like, where's mom? Where's Dave? And they said, oh, they left. They left for Milwaukee months ago. And that's when
Hmm.
the dad moved back home. So Kennedy kind of, yeah, that does sort of strike me as something that Dahmer would have done. Like he actually agreed that that was a pretty good, if not maybe the correct hypothesis, like because
Right.
otherwise, because he was talking to his dad, like because he knew that Joyce didn't want to talk to the dad, but I mean, he was checking in with Jeff, and never once did he say, "Oh, mom and dad or mom and Dave have left. I'm here by myself." He wanted to be left alone because he wanted to be left alone with those fantasies and perhaps do something with it. I don't think he was necessarily going to commit a murder, but I think he wanted to have a place where he could bring back somebody and, sort of explore sexual, feelings a little bit and just have that privacy for that. And as it turned
Sure.
out, the kid did hang out with him. They did have some fun. They drank and they smoked a bit of pot and they discussed music and whatever. And when it wasn't until that guy wanted to leave, I got to go. My friends are waiting for me at a concert. I got to leave. That's when Jeff took over and said, well, no, I don't want you to leave, and then hit him. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I think that was one of those things that that kind of I know what you're saying. You kind of start to think about things sort of outside of what you know or think you know about something, and it does kind of, because you kind of feel like you're getting to know the character, well, character in this case, the killer, Jeff.
Yes.
And I really felt like I had to learn as much as I could about him in order to properly do the book justice.
Yeah, like to your point of the killing of Stephen Hicks that you were just talking about, the hitchhiker that came, to the house, that was something like where it's dealt with in my book as more of a dream sequence or whatever. I really relied on astrology a lot, knowing Jeff's horoscope and his tendency. Again, this is from an astrological lens, and I honor people that find this as something not tenable. But as an astrologer for 45 years, I can tell you it works. But Jeff had an extremely explosive temper that was kept under sort of this, he had a Mars Moon Aries conjunction, which is this kind of volcanic, explosive, impulsive, primal expression of
Mhm.
desires. But then he had a Libra ascendant, which is probably the most like easygoing, decorous, polite, wants harmony, everybody gets along, it's
Mhm.
equanimity all around, so he had that demeanor, but then beneath that this explosive desire nature. And so as I unpacked the whole murder of Stephen Hicks, I really felt it was something utterly impulsive and not meant to like kill. It probably, dovetailed into his fantasy of knocking out the jogger,
The jogger, yes,
and
yeah,
just
more in
having,
keeping with that fantasy, yeah. Hmm.
yes. And it just went over the edge though. And then
Hmm.
Jeff made bad decision after bad decision, decided to
Hmm.
strangle him because he felt he'd be permanently damaged because of what the head wound looked like, and that crazy kind of
Hmm.
logic that came in and then facilitated the actual murder. But anyway, yeah, these are the interesting things, and trying to think through things that we don't have facts about. And it sounds like we both have different methods of doing that. Yours is much more grounded than mine, or at least some people would say. Well, Robyn, I really want to thank you for today's carving the time out to meet.
Oh,
And
absolutely. This was fascinating, and I really enjoyed our conversation, and great questions and great
oh,
insights.
good. And I
Hmm.
want to remind the listeners, Robyn and Patrick Kennedy's book is titled Grilling Dahmer: The Interrogation of the Milwaukee Cannibal. And that I will have a link up to that. I can do, to Amazon and also to your publisher if people
Oh,
want
sure.
to get it directly from them. That's it for today, Robyn. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank
And
you. I really enjoyed it, and as I said, keep me in mind when you start to share your novel, because I'd be really interested in having a look
oh
at it for
God,
you.
yes, absolutely. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Yes, you too, Frederick. Talk to
All
you
right,
later.
darling. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye bye.